All right, well, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are, and hello from the NASPA office in Washington, D.C. I hope everyone is enjoying Careers and Student Affairs Month so far this October. My name is Jasmine Scott, and I'm the Assistant Director of Member Engagement working with student and new professional initiatives at NASPA. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our first Suzanne Live briefing of the month. And this session is advocating for students' public policy as a core competency for all student affairs professionals. Before we get started, we do want to walk you through some of the technical components of the program today. So Terry, if you want to go ahead and get us started.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first. We get the honor of kicking off the month-long webcast series for Careers and Student Affairs Month. So I'll go through the tech introductions, and then I'll introduce Diana and I. So at this time, please minimize all other applications so that you can see and hear our presentation today. Our presentation is about an hour long, and we will leave time for questions at the end. So you'll want to have your keyboard handy to enter any questions that you have, and you can do that anytime throughout the presentation. If you cannot hear anyone talking right now, this is a little bit of a pointless discussion, but you need to be connected to audio. You should have a gray menu on your screen right now, and somewhere on that you will see this audio control panel, which usually defaults to being open when you log into GoToWebinar. If it isn't, however, you can access your audio controls by clicking on the plus sign next to the word audio on your menu. This will allow you to choose between telephone or mic and speakers, which you can switch between during the presentation if one stops working well for you. To use your telephone, use the access code and PIN that are located on your menu on your screen, not the ones here on the slide, as these are only an example. Attendees will be muted throughout the session. If you have a question or comment during the presentation, you'll be able to send it in to us using the questions box located further down on your menu. Again, you can open it by clicking on the plus sign next to the word questions. Diana and I will be responding to these at the end of the presentation, and we will go through the question box and read out the questions so that everyone knows what has been asked and what we're responding to. If you're having technical issues, Jasmine or Diana or I will respond to you privately, and you'll need to be able to view the control panel in order to see our response when we do that. In case that menu starts to get in your way, you can hide it by clicking on the orange arrow on the top of the vertical strip of icons that hangs out there on the side of your menu. If you need it back to ask a question or to give feedback or to see one of our responses if you submitted a technical question, go ahead and click on it again and it will slide back out. That does it for our technical directions. We are recording this session, and the recording and the slides will be made available next week. You'll be notified by email when the recording is available. Thank you so much for your attention to our brief technical information, and now we'll move into our presentation. My name is Terry Hines. I'm the Director of Policy Research and Advocacy with NASPA. I've been with NASPA since late January of this year, so about as long as the current presidential administration and the Congress that's currently in session. So there's been a pretty dynamic first 9 months, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but I wanted to also give Diana Ali a chance to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Terry and Jasmine, for that great intro. My name is Diana. I work as a policy analyst with the research and policy team at NASPA. I've been working at NASPA for a little bit over a year, and I have a background in community-based nonprofit work, and I have a master's degrees in social work and public policy.
Excellent. So we're going to take a little bit of a different approach to our time with you all today than you might see in other Careers and Student Affairs Month presentation. Rather than focus on how we got into our roles and how others who might want to do what we do can follow in our footsteps, we've decided to instead talk about how all of you, no matter what or where your future career takes you, can and should be tuned into public policy conversations, how they'll influence your day-to-day work, and how you can use your knowledge and expertise to influence public policy to better serve our students. We're happy to connect with those of you who want to do what we do as a career. If you're interested in being a policy analyst or a director of policy research and advocacy, please feel free to email us and we'll follow up with you individually. But because so much of what we actually do on a day-to-day basis is work to facilitate raising the voices of student affairs professionals, which is you all, we thought it would be a better use of our time today to highlight how you can be part of that no matter what career path you find yourself in. And we will get wonky, so for those of you who came here for some policy wonkery, we'll get into a little bit of that as we go along too. So Diana mentioned that we are part of the Research and Policy Institute at NASPA, which is one of the divisions within the NASPA Association that provides some thought leadership around policy and practice. So we are one part of the Research and Policy Institute, and there are several other members of the RPI team that work on some more focused projects and initiatives, areas such as emergency aid on campus, comprehensive student records project. A partnership with ACRO is managed out of the RPI, as well as our data and analytics folks within the association. So we really the focus of the RPI is really around this idea of how do we connect policy and practice on a very fundamental, sort of functional day-to-day level. How do we raise those issues that student affairs thinks are key on our campuses, but also raise the voice of our members who are in the midst of working on those issues in policy conversations with policymakers at the national level. The policy and advocacy team, which is Diana and I, and we also sometimes claim Dr. Jill Dunlap, who is our Director of Equity, Inclusion, and Violence Prevention and our resident expert on all things Title IX. So we adopt her periodically as well, as she allows us to. We work to provide members of NASPA with overviews of key federal and state policy conversations relevant to your work on campus. At the same time, though, we liaise between you all and national higher education associations that are working in partnership with us to inform both the field at large and policymakers about the effect of past and proposed policy on our campuses, and that's federal and state policy. And we'll get into a little bit more of what that looks like as we go on today. One of the ways that we make sure we're in touch with the voice of student affairs professionals like you is through the Public Policy Division. The Public Policy Division is one of the membership governance groups within NASPA, and we're the staff liaisons to the division. The division consists of representatives from each of the U.S. geographic regions within NASPA, several of the other divisions within NASPA, so we have a representative from the Community Colleges Division and the Small Colleges and Universities Division, as well as representative to the National Knowledge Community Leadership. We also have a couple of at-large members that we bring in when we need specific knowledge or expertise in a policy area of importance to the division. So in the past, we've had at-large members who've contributed expertise in areas around employment related to the Fair Labor Standards Act overtime rule and campus sexual assault response and prevention. Dr. Larry Ward, whose picture you see on your slide, is the chair of the PPD, and he provides a lot of the leadership and the guidance for the work that the division does. So he recently did a blog post on the PPD section of the NASPA website, and in that he said, now more than ever, student affairs professionals at all levels of expertise need to be thoughtfully engaged in a range of policy issues that have profound implications for who can benefit from higher education. Indeed, there is considerable anxiety on our campuses related to protections for individual identity, international and undocumented students, mental and emotional health, and collective affordability. Those are all central issues that we deal with on a day-to-day basis in the policy and advocacy team, but we also know that you're dealing with them on a day-to-day basis no matter what role you're playing on your campus with your students. So one of the things that the PPD is working on is trying to find a way to bring your member voices more into our public policy conversations. And to that end, they are sponsoring a town hall on November 15th at 1:30 in the afternoon Eastern time, and more information will be provided about this and opportunities to sign up for it in a couple of weeks, so keep an eye out on your NASPA weekly update email for information about that. The topic of that town hall will be campus free speech and intellectual diversity, so a topic that everybody's on a lot of people's minds as policymakers discuss it, as well as members on campus discuss it, so we look forward to hearing from you there. The Public Policy Division guides the development of the NASPA Public Policy Agenda, which is what governs the association's policy efforts and attention. So it's not just the Public Policy Division's efforts and attentions, but also NASPA as a whole. The agenda is approved by the NASPA board, and it's admittedly and intentionally somewhat broad to reflect the breadth and diversity of the field of student affairs. The most recent version of the agenda, which is briefly summarized on your screen right now, was approved by the board at the summer 2017 meeting and is largely in line with the previous agenda, though some of the items have been clarified, and we did add the civic engagement and freedom of expression item as its own tenet within the policy agenda because those issues are so relevant for our campuses right now. The rest of our talk today is going to take a closer look at how you can, no matter what career you eventually decide on, so if you go into residence life, if you decide you want to become a VP of Student Affairs, if you want to work on the student engagement or campus activity side, how can you take that experience and safely and productively engage in public policy conversations for the benefits of your students. We'll start by laying out some key terms and talking through ways that institutions and individuals can engage in advocacy that won't get you into any hot water. We'll then step quickly through some specific issues to give you a bit of background and start you on your journey, as well as some resources you can use to learn more and further your reach. It's important to keep in mind as we go through our examples today, though, that they're just a few of the many issues and topics that student affairs professionals work with. We strongly encourage you, and this is the sort of shameless plug part, to subscribe to updates from the RPI blog, which we post to regularly, to get regular updates and information about current policy issues affecting student affairs as a field and higher education as a whole. The RPI blog is found at naspa.org/RPI. I'm going to turn it over to Diana now for our next section.
Thanks so much, Terry. So first we will go over some definitions. So lobbying is taking a specific stand and or advocating for a specific action on a specific piece of legislation. This is different from advocacy, which focuses on a specific issue without mentioning specific policy or legislation. And the lines can get very blurry when we talk about advocacy, because there is this form of advocacy called grassroots advocacy, which can be lobbying if it targets specific legislation or includes a call to action. Finally, the definition of policy analysis is really revolving around education, providing explanation, context, and knowledge around specific legislation without advocating for a specific stance or action. Generally, most of the work you will engage with professionally will be advocacy and analysis or education. If you do engage in lobbying as part of your official duties in your job, you'll want to be in touch with your campus government or public affairs offices so they can make sure that you're staying in line with their messaging. Personally, you may also engage in activity around specific legislation, but it's not considered lobbying when it's just you, when it's just the individual. Only when you're representing a group or an organization would it be considered lobbying. We'll get into more details as we go on. So next, we want to talk about different levels at which you might engage. So these include institutional advocacy, faculty and staff advocacy on campus, personal advocacy, supporting student advocacy, and promoting civic learning and democratic engagement. Your institution might take positions on stances or issues or propose legislation, or you as faculty and staff might work internally to advocate for specific institutional policies or stances. So we'll go over a few examples of that. Keep in mind, however, that the boundaries between these distinctions are not always super defined, and sometimes the lines can become a bit blurry.
So talking at the highest level, institutional advocacy. Institutional advocacy are positions that your institution or campus officially takes as the institution. So it's our campus believes this thing, and we are going to promote this particular view or idea. So examples of what institutional advocacy looks like are public statements of support, sign-ons to community or association letters, and some of those statements may count as lobbying if they specifically mention legislation. And the reason that the difference between lobbying and advocacy is really important to keep in mind is that as nonprofit institutions, and this, if you are at a for-profit institution, this may not apply to you in the same way, but as nonprofit institutions, most of higher education is governed by the laws around how much lobbying we can do and still maintain our nonprofit status. Now, none of you are going to be in any danger of running into that that level that's going to push your institution over the edge to jeopardize your nonprofit status, but it is something you need to be aware of, that keeping track of the lobbying time that you spent may be something that your institution asks you to do if this becomes something you're expected to do as part of your formal position or job. But those public statements and then outreach directly to policymakers through your campus government affairs or public affairs staff does count as lobbying, so it will be tracked and it will be recorded. Generally speaking, even, I would say, vice presidents of student affairs are not going to be doing a whole lot of direct lobbying work in their roles. But understanding the difference between lobbying and advocacy can help you guide your institution and participate in conversations with campus leadership or with your supervisors about the options that you have if you want to take action or express a statement about a particular issue. If you are going to take a particular stand on a topic or on a piece of legislation, we strongly encourage that you reach out to your campus leadership. If you have dedicated government affairs staff, they're great people to get to know, or your public affairs staff or senior leadership will help make sure that your messaging as a campus stays cohesive and coherent. Other areas, though, of institutional level advocacy that are not necessarily related to public statements or stances include intentional review of policies with focus on barriers for specific groups. So the equity scorecard is a model of this that works as an example. It's developed by the University of Southern California Center for Urban Education, and it's a way of looking at institutional policies that might create unintentional barriers to students of color or students from historically marginalized populations. So it's a process for really looking at that institutional review of policies to remove barriers for individuals. And then also a form of institutional advocacy is clear communications on policies and practices. So making sure that people understand what your campus policies and procedures are, particularly as we start to talk about things related to underserved or historically marginalized populations, or if we're talking about veterans policies, what are the access and opportunities that are available for veterans that may be different, or that maybe they get access to because of their status as veterans. So those types of communications can also be considered advocacy. Statements about, for instance, making available scholarship dollars to undocumented students. That's a form of advocacy on behalf of undocumented students that is made through a sort of communication about an institutional policy or practice.
Faculty and staff might advocate on campus through using personal influence and resources as trusted members of the campus community to advocate for issues and populations that may not otherwise have strong advocates. So as faculty and staff, you might be able to strategically push campus conversations with stakeholders. Also create space for marginalized populations to feel safe and speak without having to disclose various statuses and identities such as undocumentation. In the classroom and through student support services, faculty and staff can create safe and brave spaces for marginalized students by creating challenging spaces that foster equal participation around classmates, and by offering support resources and tools through centers on campus. NASPA actually has a newly released policy and practice white paper, Safe Spaces and Brave Spaces, Historical Context and Recommendations for Student Affairs Professionals, if you are interested in more information on safe and brave spaces. Faculty and staff can also connect students to community organizations surrounding the campus and foster those relationships with those organizations, such as food banks and child care centers and public transportation and carpooling, and advocacy organizations that might really support students. Faculty and staff can also support students engaged in advocacy by connecting students to student associations and organizations like Young Invincibles or Student Veterans of America that do direct lobbying or advocacy. On the topic of personal advocacy, this is really where you as an individual can draw on your own professional expertise. So there are a number of do's and don'ts when advocating on behalf of yourself and not your institution. For one, you must be clear that you are not speaking as a representative of your employer or institution. You can do this through a statement if you are speaking, a disclaimer in social media profiles, or whatnot if you are writing something online. For example, in my personal time, I definitely build my personal skill set around being able to advocate for folks in my neighborhood and in my networks, but that's not something that I personally do as a part of NASPA, but just because I want to be the best personal advocate that I can be. You can establish your expertise as a student affairs professional and use institutionally based examples. To faces to stories, points, without implying that you're officially representing your employer. So we've compiled a little bit of a list of, and sorry for the, I live in a big city, I live in Chicago, I'm sorry for like the sirens in the background. So we compiled a list of things not to do when you are advocating as an individual. And this would be to use your university email address or phone to contact legislators or engage in campaign activities or direct advocacy or lobbying. This would be to wear any kind of campus branded clothing while attending partisan or political events or protests. This would be to use the university provided IT system, and this is an important one, to engage in advocacy. Possibly working from a work laptop to check your personal email or connecting to campus employee-only internet services could be grounds for a misuse of and misrepresenting the organization that you are with. So often the question is asked if this looks different at public versus private institutions, and yes, in some ways and no in others. Public institutions engaging in institutional advocacy must be conscious of their dependency on state and federal funds, and this is really important. Public institutions oftentimes have to work with the state and federal policymakers. Employees must exercise care to be good stewards of public funds. Employees at private institutions can be legally discriminated against for their public advocacy and views, and this might be within the limits of the law. The limits around this are fluid. If a private institution deems the employee's views to be misaligned with their own institutional mission and values, they may be within their legal rights to fire that individual. Both public and private institutions are mainly nonprofits when in the grounds of higher education. Again, if you are not coming from a 501c3, then this does not apply to you. But if you are, this really limits the allowances for lobbying, either direct or indirect, which Terry talked about earlier. Finally, I want to touch on personally advocating through the use of online media. We are seeing this more and more, and the boundaries within this can become easily blurred. You might not want to declare representation of your institution through personal media posts. If social media boundaries are typically blurred in terms of professional and personal contacts, consider creating separate and private social media to share personal beliefs. If using an institutional account, please avoid taking a partisan stance on issues and defer to the work of programs representing students impacted by the policy, such as a resource center supporting first-gen or undocumented students as the avenue to raise awareness on specific issues.
So moving into how you can support your students, the students that you work with and their advocacy, there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of ways to do this. One of the biggest concerns, though, is to remember that not all of your students may share the same views that you have. And as a student affairs professional, it's important to be welcoming and open to the advocacy that your students are interested in engaging in, regardless of whether it's something that you personally believe. So that's where that policy analysis piece that we talked about at the beginning comes into play, where you can certainly work to educate students about the issues that they're interested in and help guide them towards good and trustworthy resources. So along those lines, you can invite associations and organizations to come to campus. So just a couple of examples of organizations that are active on campus or that maintain campus-based programming that you can bring to your campus formally. Student Veterans of America is one example. They have campus-based chapters where you can have student SVA volunteers active on your campus. United We Dream does quite a bit of work on our college campuses, especially right now around DACA. And then the Southern Poverty Law Center has an on-campus program that creates materials and allows chapters to officially affiliate with the SBLC to do some social justice work and on campus, specifically targeted for on-campus populations. So that's one way that you can really bring in sort of the additional voices and diffuse the work a little bit so that you're not being asked necessarily to have all the answers, but rather to provide connections to associations or organizations that can help your students sort of take that next step if they're looking to become more engaged in advocacy and activism. And then finally, one of the most, I'd say, well-established versions of supporting student advocacy is really that idea of promoting active civic engagement and democratic learning. So NASPA's LEAD initiative, as well as the Civic Learning and Democratic Engagement Knowledge Community and Annual Conference, is one of our most visible activities around this. They work to sponsor the, I forget the name of the actual campaign, but it's a voter registration drive every year that they do with students and with campuses to provide materials, again, to help encourage students to become active and engaged citizens in our democracy. And I think that that's really an important part of higher education and of the community that exists on most campuses. So working intentionally to support and build that is a form of advocacy. You're educating people about how to become active in our democracy and really connect them to those issues and get them involved and engaged. So we are going to shift now to try and talk about those advocacy examples within a couple of specific policy realms. So we've just pulled, as I said, a couple of specific examples from the policy issues that we're tracking to do a little bit more of a deeper dive on with you this afternoon or morning. So we're going to talk a little bit more about some immigration policy, specifically around undocumented individuals. So this is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, otherwise known as DACA, as well as a little bit on sanctuary campuses. And then talk about sort of some of more specific actions that you at the institution or at the individual or at the faculty and staff level might be able to take to engage in advocacy in your role on campus. We're going to give another example then, following that, around trans students' rights and protections. And this is going to focus on the Title IX guidance that was issued under the Obama Department of Education and the resulting federal court cases and much of the state bathroom bill legislation. So there's been a lot happening since the start of the year around both of these issues that affect our campuses, and they're going to allow us to dig into policy at several levels. We're going to look at some federal and state legislative activity as well as federal executive action. And again, I want to be really clear that these are not the only issues we're tracking in any of these areas, but they're good examples for us to use because they'll show how policy decisions influence the day-to-day lives of our student affairs professionals and how you can work then to influence those policy conversations both on and off campus. For information on other policy issues that we're tracking, including guns on campus, free speech and controversial speakers, campus sexual assault prevention and response, and many, many more, please check out the RPI blog, as I mentioned earlier, which is at naspa.org/RPI. Before we jump right into the details, though, of these two specific examples, we thought it might be helpful to give you some broad background on the federal and state policy environments we're currently operating under. So the broad tenets, so as I mentioned, I started at NASPA at the end of January, which is right as the Trump administration was coming into office, and we had a congressional turnover to Republican control of both the House and the Senate. So what that tells us, that's sort of the high level as we transition the president and the executive branch from Democrat to Republican. We knew going into this that was going to signal some changes in how the executive offices approached policy and policy making. We know that the broad tenets at the GOP include things like smaller government and generally focus on the enforcement of policies rather than using the government to create social services. So rollback of that previous executive overreach, we hear President Trump talk about that frequently in terms of his wanting to roll back some of the executive overreach of the Obama administration. But then also we see that enforcement action come through in much tighter enforcement of immigration laws and immigration policies. And congressional Republicans, again, that switch of control of the House and the Senate to Republican control, we see some of those same conversations that are going to come through. There's a big emphasis on deregulation, removing regulations around teacher education, gainful employment, the Fair Labor Standards Act overtime rule, accountability for higher education, as well as a preference for state control of decision making and policy making. So we are starting to see some of that come through, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that influences the policy conversations in immigration and in trans student rights as we go through our examples later. So recognizing that there are those preferences to leave policy implementation and decision-making with the states, that makes the composition of the state legislatures more important than it might be under a Democrat administration. So much of what happens on campus is also governed at the state level, at least for public institutions, that understanding how the state legislators are working will help us predict the kind of policy that they're more likely to focus on and pass into law. So you can see here, this is a map of the United States that's provided by the National Council of State Legislatures, showing the party that has control, or whether the government is split for every state. And you can see on this map, you don't have to count them all. I'm going to tell you that Republicans control both chambers of the legislature in bicameral legislations, which is everyone except Nebraska, in 32 states, and that's up from 30 states in 2016. So the 2016 election had 2 additional states go to full Republican control of both chambers. And you can see by the map, it's most of the middle of the country, New Hampshire and Alaska. Democrats control both chambers in 13 states, which is again up from 12. So it wasn't that the Democrats lost ground, it's more that the states that were previously split are now under single party control, and that's most of the coastal states that you see there. In addition to control of the legislatures, though, we also have many states, 30 or 31, there's conflicting reports there that I haven't fully fleshed out the details on, that have what are known as trifectas or strongholds, where the party that holds the governorship also has a majority in the Senate and a majority in the state house. 25 of those states are Republican controlled, and the remaining 5 or 6 are Democratic controlled. So the other 25 states, or the other, 20 states do not have, they're split, so their governors of a different party than either of than the control of the state house. So with that as background to keep in mind as we move through our conversation, we're going to move into now talking a little bit more about the issues.
Thanks, Terry. So in the topic area around immigration, we know that immigration policy affects both international students and undocumented students and undocumented individuals overall. As student affairs professionals, certainly might be undocumented themselves. And for this presentation today, we are focusing specifically on the population of undocumented individuals. So I first want to talk about the DACA program, or the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, which was enacted in 2012 by the Obama administration. This program was pivotal of its time, but also, only was able to support certain individuals that met a pretty stringent eligibility standard. It allowed undocumented immigrants to register for work permits, provided them with social security numbers so that they could go to college and oftentimes apply for scholarships and whatnot. But it did not provide a pathway to citizenship or legal status. It really only deferred action targeting the deportation of individuals by ICE or the Department of Homeland Security. The Trump administration has now rescinded this executive action, DACA, which was possible because this was an executive action that did not go through Congress. So it did not have the kind of permanency that legislation that passes through Congress has. So this program has now been rescinded as of September 5th, 2017. It's been rescinded with a 6-month delay. So the program will be entirely ending March 5th of 2018. Enrollees of the DACA program could re-enroll for another 2-year permit up until October 5th, so this past week, and that deadline has now passed. When the Trump administration decided to rescind DACA, as part of that announcement, President Trump called on Congress to pass legislation that would protect undocumented immigrants that arrived as children, but it is unclear whether or not what legislation may eventually pass. So we have a number of forms of federal legislation on the table. So there is this kind of reliance on Congress right now and an extreme sense of urgency in order to keep this program alive.
Okay, so with that little bit of background on DACA, and again, we have more information available on our website if you're looking to go deeper dive into the policy behind DACA, we wanted to switch now to talking about some more specific advocacy options. So some examples that you may be able to work within your institution to do, particularly around DACA, are encourage your institution to sign on to ACE, the American Council on Education, is circulating an institutional sign-on letter during what they're calling it a theme week around undocumented individuals and DACA, which will start officially next week. But they sent out an email this morning to presidents of college campuses encouraging them to sign on to a sign-on letter that will eventually be submitted to Congress, indicating support for some legislative solution to protect DACA protected individuals. So the sign-on letter does not provide a specific, does not endorse a specific piece of legislation, but rather encourages Congress to take some action to provide protection similar to the protections allowed under DACA. So if you would like to work with your campus leadership to sign on to that letter, I encourage you to reach out through your senior leadership and ask them to look into the ACE institutional sign-on letter. You can also reach out directly through your campus affairs, your campus government affairs directly to policymakers to tell stories about your students. So your institution, again, could decide that you really want to work with your state or federal legislators to encourage them to do what's right to protect the undocumented faculty, staff, and students on your campus, and you may want to organize a campaign directly with your government affairs staff to reach out to them and tell their stories. And again, this idea of institutional review of policies with a focus on barriers for undocumented individuals. So taking a look at policies that might require a driver's license or a social security number for students to take advantage of programs or initiatives. Do you really need a driver's license for that? Is driving an essential part, or will another form of identification work? Similarly, do you need a social security number for a particular program, or have you been using it as a convenient way to sort of uniquely identify students? And again, can you use another form of a student ID number to track individual participations? And then looking at creating scholarship opportunities. What opportunities exist for students to apply for and receive scholarships that maybe don't hinge on their citizenship status? Are they eligible for in-state tuition? In some states they are, and in others they aren't. So those are options and things that you can look at within your institution to identify places where you might have put in unintentional barriers in place for undocumented individuals that you can address as you work to improve their access to higher education. So again, on sort of keeping this idea of institutional advocacy, clear communications around policy and practices. So this is the sanctuary campus conversation, because many campuses, as soon as President Trump was elected, because he had campaigned on a platform of rescinding DACA, and very quickly after he took office, began to enforce, enact greater enforcement of immigration laws. Many campuses felt that they wanted to do more to protect their undocumented students, so they declared themselves as sanctuary campuses. And that's a great symbolic gesture that you can take on your campus, but it unfortunately doesn't have any legal standing. There's not a legal definition or anything under the law that a sanctuary campus entitles students to. But that doesn't mean that campuses cannot protect undocumented students. So you don't need to declare yourself a sanctuary campus to provide protections for your students. There's all kinds of protections that you can provide to students around keeping secure their information, as well as providing access to campus. So one of those things that you can help to communicate on your campus is clear information about what your campus policies are around protecting student information and protecting students and access to campus. One thing that you may want to look into is the sensitive locations policy from ICE. So that's Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. Under their policy, college campuses are considered sensitive locations, which basically means that ICE officials will not come to engage in enforcement actions on campus without notifying campus leadership. So there's been some question as to whether this policy would be maintained with under the Trump administration, given their tighter enforcement of immigration policies. But the IACLEA, which I can't remember the full acronym, what it stands for, but they're the Campus Police Association, has been in communication with ICE to confirm that the sensitive locations policy is still being honored. So ICE officials may be on your campus for regulatory purposes around the International Student Visa Tracking System, which I think is USIS, so there may be ICE officials on your campus, but those officials will not be there for enforcement actions without notifying campus leadership. So making it clear to students that if they see an ICE official on campus, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're there to take an enforcement action against a student or faculty or staff member. And then another thing to be clear about, and this is a conversation again to have your campus police department, is that local and campus police are not legally required to assist ICE or the Department of Homeland Security. So ICE, this is a point of contention for Attorney General Jeff Sessions. He would prefer that campus police and local police were required to detain individuals that they suspect may be here without documentation, but local and campus police are not required to do that. There is a law that was passed in Texas Senate Bill 4, that would require local and campus police to detain individuals who have suspected documentation issues by ICE or DHS, but that bill has been stayed by a judge, so it's not currently in action. So again, taking a look more closely at your campus policies around campus police, as well as communication around who is allowed to be on campus and when, may help to provide some ease for your undocumented populations on campus. And then finally, data do not have to be shared. So one of the concerns that's been raised around DACA students is that they have a bunch of information that is stored by their college campuses, and will that data be shared with ICE or Homeland Security for enforcement purposes? And FERPA, which is the Federal Education Rights or the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, says that disclosure of student personally identifiable information, which includes things like your name and your address, your contact information, can only be done to comply with a judicial order or a lawfully issued subpoena. And ICE detainers are not judicial orders. They're orders that are used internally by ICE and DHS. So institutions do not have to disclose personally identifiable information about their students in response to an ICE detainer, only a judicial order or a lawfully issued subpoena. So you can take steps to protect your students' data under FERPA, as well as under other policies and procedures.
Transitioning to the lens of faculty and staff advocacy on campus, one key piece here is to provide services to students, staff, and faculty. This can be through the referrals to legal clinics, partnering with community-based agencies such as United We Dream, but this can also come in the form of auditing academic program requirements for challenges or barriers, such as including forms asking about citizenship status or a social security number. This can be a compilation of safe faculty and staff who are knowledgeable and can support students. This could be trainings to ensure that students feel safe in the classroom and ensure that opportunities and experiences are equitable regardless of immigration status. Faculty and staff might also tell the stories of DACA recipients to the public and policymakers. The only kind of caveat that we want to pose here is avoiding a good versus bad immigrant narrative in the process, as all immigrants deserve basic rights regardless of status. And if you happen to be a part of NASPA, you can feel free to join the NASPA Undocumented Immigrants and Allies Knowledge KC in order to learn more. Finally, RPI, the Research and Policy Institute here at NASPA, offers a number of live briefings and blog posts around undocumentation and on DACA. We just had one in the month of August that actually provided a number of resources for faculty and staff to advocate on their campuses. So you might want to check that out on our NASPA online learning community. Through the lens of personal advocacy.
Sorry, I will advance the screen in just a second.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so on the lens of personal advocacy, which would be drawing on your own professional expertise. And I can just chat about it. We really encourage you, if you have a congressional representative that you would like to reach out to do so. As I mentioned earlier, when I brought up the topic of DACA, there is a number of proposed legislation out there right now at the federal level designed to protect dreamers. Most of these provide a pathway to citizenship, such as the DREAM Act of 2017, the American Hope Act of 2017, and Recognizing America's Children Act. There's also the Bridge Act, which would essentially just reinstate the benefits of the DACA program. Also, we are seeing federal legislation proposed to reform immigration entirely, and this is mainly to increase immigration enforcement, such as the Davis-Oliver Act, which would increase immigration enforcement, but not so aggressive as making the E-Verify system, which would check the legal status of workers and applicants, mandatory for all employers in the U.S. And then we've been seeing so much about the RAISE Act, which would be a complete transformation of immigration policy, giving priority based on a scorecard of certain identifying traits, such as ability to speak English, income prospects, and job skills. And these priorities are similar to those of immigration law prior to 1965, which limited entrance to non-white groups. So if some of this legislation is something that you're a proponent for or you're against, we encourage as an individual for you to contact your congressional representatives. Also, you can use personal social media to educate friends and family and share information. But in this process, we do want to point out the caveat of not outing anybody unintentionally by revealing their status or identity without their permission.
So moving back into supporting student advocacy, again, as we referred to in the overview slides, you can bring associations and organizations to campus, specifically United We Dream and the Southern Poverty Law Center on Campus program, which will help provide content and materials for your students who are interested in engaging in advocacy themselves. And then just again, that caveat that undocumented immigrants are feeling especially vulnerable right now, so we need to take care not to cause unintentional harm. Students and faculty and staff are often very passionate about these issues, but sometimes we need to be a little more strategic and cautious as we approach these conversations to make sure that we don't trigger unintentional responses from policymakers or from others in our community. So we are running a bit short on time, so I'm going to go very quickly through our second example, and again, there's more information available about this this issue on our website and on our blog. So talking about trans student protections, there's been a number of executive and judicial actions just this year around this. So the Departments of Education and Justice submitted a Dear Colleague letter rescinding the Obama Ed status for trans students in this spring. And that was a reversal of the policy from the Department of Education under President Obama that required institutions or recommended institutions provide gender-neutral facilities for trans students. As a result of that rescinding of the Dear Colleague letter, the Supreme Court remanded the case Gloucester County School Board versus GG, the Gavin Grimm case, back to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. We also saw then on the other side of that conversation, though, a court advanced through the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals to uphold the Title IX prohibitions against sex discrimination in Whitaker versus Kenosha Unified School District. And then again, sort of in our ping pong game of going back the other direction, in June, the Office of Civil Rights and the Department of Education changed their procedure on complaints regarding trans students. So we've seen a lot of back and forth on this issue in the executive and judicial branches as we move forward. Outside of the areas of sort of schools and college campuses, we're also seeing action to limit the rights of trans individuals to participate in the military. And then also just this week, we saw that there were actions taken to overturn guidance that was issued under the Obama administration that would extend Title VII anti-discrimination laws in employment based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So just this week, Attorney General Sessions issued a memo to reverse that stance and overturn that guidance. And it's unclear yet how that will play out and what that will look like as we move forward, but definitely indicating that we are seeing some reversal of policies regarding protection of trans individual rights and protections. So Diana, I think, is going to run us through a quick update on the bathroom bills.
Sure, I know. I am a little bit worried about the time. Okay, so I will just say really quickly on the topic of bathroom bills, we've been tracking from the 2016-2017 state legislative cycle that there were 16 states which filed 29 bathroom bills. So we will be looking, forward in the next legislative cycle coming up to see what pops up then. 13 of these bills are still pending, but they are stalled in committee. So we don't expect to see any bathroom bills passed through the end of the 2017 state legislative session. The last few bathroom bills that we were focused on were those in Texas during the special session, and that was House Bill 46 and House Bill 50, and we might see similar legislation introduced in the next legislative cycle. Mainly, the kind of legislation that we'll be looking at in the next legislative cycle will be that regarding preventing local jurisdictions from passing non-discrimination ordinances, which essentially becomes a bathroom bill in disguise because it leaves regulation of bathroom access solely in control of the legislature. And this is what we saw happen in North Carolina when the very controversial bathroom bill HB2 was finally rescinded, but replaced with this legislation that maintains a key feature of this HB2, which is the prevention of these non-discrimination ordinances from being passed. So that's a little background on that.
Okay, so again, moving quickly in the respect of time. So what are some of the institutional advocacy options that your institution can take? Again, making public statements about non-discrimination in admissions, housing, and hiring. Those would be important things to include and to reinforce right now, given this current environment, that would signal your institution's support for trans individuals and their rights. Obviously, still reaching out through your government affairs staff, but who you would be reaching out to in this case would likely be the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights staff. So trying to find out, there are local offices for OCR across the country that you might be able to reach out to arrange meetings to reaffirm your support for trans individuals and their rights. And then again, taking a look at your institutional policies with a focus on unintentional barriers for trans individuals. Do you make available gender-neutral facilities, restrooms and locker rooms, and housing? Do you ask for gender when you don't need it? Do you need to know the gender of students who might be attending a career services event, for instance? And then policies around, so campus-based policies around the use of chosen names and pronouns, and how are those communicated broadly? There's a couple of resources specifically for policies. There's a Campus Pride Trans Policy Clearinghouse, which if you were to Google that, it's campuspride.org/TPC, that provides example policies from institutions around the country that you might find interesting or useful to share on your campus if you're trying to start some of these conversations. Faculty and staff on campus, again, as they could with undocumented students and staff, provide services to faculty and staff. So again, referrals to free legal clinics, name change resources, Lambda Legal and the Transgender Law Center are both good resources that you can look at for your own purposes, but also refer individuals to for help in finding legal services that would help them. You can also host a study group. Dr. Zena Colazzo put together a trans study in higher education syllabus that is absolutely fantastic, and walks you through a course of reading around trans history in higher education. So he's made that available, or Z's made that available rather, to members of the student affairs community. The link is provided on the screen. It's also embedded in the slides. And then we also, if you are a member of NASPA, you can follow the Equity, Inclusion, and Social Justice Division, which is our newest division within NASPA, and they are focusing on a wide variety of equity, inclusion, and social justice issues, including trans rights. Personally, again, you can do many of the same things that we've talked about at the faculty and staff level, or that were referenced in the undocumented immigrants level, reaching out yourself, using your professional experience to talk to the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights, the Department of Justice, your state elected officials, especially if you're a state that has a bathroom bill pending or is introduced to next year, using your personal social media to educate family and friends and share information, and then also attending events and being visible as an ally. It's important for people to understand that these issues are central to all of our campuses and our communities, not just the individuals directly influenced or affected. So student advocacy options, again, this sounds a little bit like a broken record, so I'm glad we're going through this a little bit fast, but you can invite those associations and organizations to come to campus to help engage your students and encourage them to engage with community organizations. So the Southern Poverty Law Center on campus, again, is a great opportunity for you to use, to reach out to for resources if your students are interested in engaging in advocacy on their own. So I do want to wrap up with just a couple minutes left, but we did want to point you to a couple of resources provided by NASPA. These are all free resources that you can participate in, whether you're a NASPA member or not, but we do weekly posts to the RPI blog. The website is up on your screen. These include a Monday post, generally, that includes policy news from the last week that is of interest to student affairs professionals. So Diana does a great job of sort of highlighting several key policy issues from the news, reports that are made available, as well as a summary of state legislation that's pending on some key topics and issues that we post early in the week every week. We also then post a Thursday post that is more of a deeper dive on a topical issue. So that's where we would start to provide some more in-depth information about trans protections or undocumented students or guns on campus. Once a month, we do a public policy briefing series. It's a half an hour, usually on a Thursday afternoon around 2:30 Eastern time. You can sign up for that through the NASPA OLC. And again, those are free resources. The members of the Public Policy Division also post blogs to their site on the NASPA website monthly that provide voices on policy information from the field. So I referenced the post by Dr. Ward that he made earlier this year, but we also just recently had a post by Dr. Gina Mastrocaza about engaging in town-gown relationships and building those partnerships with your community resources. And then we do quarterly, or sometimes less than quarterly, white papers and policy briefs. Diana mentioned the Safe Spaces and Brave Spaces that we just released, and the link to that will be available within the next couple of days. So if you're, keep an eye on our website for information about that. So Jasmine, I think we ran right up to the end of time, but did we have any questions come in?
No worries. Thank you both for a very thorough but concise and definitely digestible presentation today. We did have one question that came in, and I answered the person individually, but wanted to make sure everyone on the call could hear it. Just how do I join the NASPA Undocumented Immigrants and Allies KC? So Diana mentioned this as one way to kind of stay up to date on information related to DACA and kind of other initiatives that we're doing to support this population. So if you're wanting to join this KC or any of our other KCs, so the Gender and Sexuality KC is doing some stuff with trans rights. You just want to update your NASPA profile if you're a member at engage.naspa.org. And then you have the ability to add the KC under your communication preferences. This is how the KC will know they can communicate with you. Typically, they send out a monthly or biweekly newsletter that has initiatives and upcoming events for you all. And I do not see any other questions in our questions box.
All right.
So with that, I want to again thank you, Terry and Diana, for a great session today. And thank you all to the people who participated. This webinar was recorded and we'll make it available via the SASAM webpage once edited. We'll also send out the slides following the conclusion of today. Our next What Suzanne webinar is tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern, and that's the current state of student affairs looking towards the future with NASPA President Dr. Kevin Kruger and NASPA Board Chair Dr. Deb Moriarty. We hope you'll join us again throughout the month to kind of listen in to some of the emerging topics and areas that we're focusing on in the profession. So thank you all again and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.